Shalom. I'd like to start off by giving all glory, honor, and praises to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai Ba'ashem Rachak Wadash. Double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. And salutations to the hopeful elect, the lambs and the sheep of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. And this lesson is going to be titled 1 Samuel 18, Jealousy, a spirit that binds great men, a cautionary tale. And I was inspired to do this lesson based off the story of King Saul and David, okay, in 1 Samuel, the 18th chapter, in which, we see a young David, before he's made king, rise to prominence by, not just because of the gifts that the Lord instilled in David, but that David was able to execute these gifts in accordance to the obedience in the Lord. All right. And because he was able to execute these gifts properly in the Lord, it garnered him much praise, adoration, and, love from people, the whole nation, including King Saul. Okay. But we can see within this chapter, as we're going to read, how that love and adoration can turn to bitterness and jealousy. All right. When, one departs from the Lord. Okay. And that can only happen through the spirit of disobedience or the spirit of pride. Okay. In which, jealousy comes, because as we're going to read, there's layers to the term jealousy. There's different, applications of meaning when we, dissect that word. Okay. But the jealousy that Saul exhibits for David is not, it's not the right type of jealousy that a person wants to have. Okay. So it says, 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 9. This is going to be in the NLT, the New Living Translation. And the subtitle reads, or the subheading reads, Saul becomes jealous of David. It says, verse 1, it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Okay. And so, that's one of the greatest commandments that a person can exhibit. All right. Outside of the love for the Most High Yahweh. All right. Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. The second greatest commandment, spoken by Yahweh Shai, is to love your brother as you love yourself. All right. And it says, verse 4, Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully because the Spirit of the Lord was with him. As it says, it shall make him a quick understanding. All right. And because of David's obedience, all right, to the Lord was able to make David of a quick understanding to be able to accomplish whatever goals or missions that Saul put in place of David, all right, which exhibited a high level of competence, okay, which is a trait that's highly admired in this world, okay, and really, is a trait that is admirable in the eyes of the Lord, okay, which is competence. But it all depends on the competence and the things that the person is, putting forth their hand to do. But it says, so Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, all right, that's Goliath, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now let's see Saul's reaction here. It says, verse 8, this made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. And we're going to go into, the term jealous and also a jealous eye, because what Saul started doing was he began to eye David, okay, in a way that warranted suspicion, okay. And when one possesses, certain gifts in the Lord, it can bring about a certain spirit in others, okay, that may have, was never there, or the seed was planted, based off of circumstances, okay, or it could have been dormant, and it just needed the right opportunity to showcase itself. All right. But I wanted to ask the question. All right. I used a little, AI generator, Chat Plus. I asked the question. It said, why was Saul's jealousy toward David so intense in tandem with the evil spirit from God, the Most High? All right. Because, the story of Saul is, he was a king. Before he was a king, he kept his father's, animals, all right, the donkeys and the livestock. He was tall, I would say he was tall, according to, back then, because, the men, unlike today, weren't around 5'9", 5'10". The men back then, were tall. They were stronger. All right, they were more competent. All right, than today's men. All right, in today's generation. Okay, they actually had, responsibilities and things that they had to attend to with a mature mindset. All right, because back then they had more structure, they had more order. All right, and the parents were, much more dogmatic. All right, especially, having to serve the Lord and be up under the law. But Saul was a very you know, handsome man. All right, because the Lord wanted to give the people, their desires, and in order to have a king, they wanted, in their minds, they wanted somebody to look like a king. So the Lord gave them that. All right, through Saul. But Saul was real timid. He was shy. He was a person that he didn't want to come around. Okay. When he first was told that he was to be the king over the Lord's people, he was very timid. He hid himself, and he had all the right makings of a great king in the beginning. Okay, in the beginning. All right, but as time passed, Saul became a very proud, very self-centered, ultimately a people-fearing king. Okay. And so as a result, the Lord would tell Saul to do things through the prophet Samuel. And unlike King David, Saul, he would get it sometimes. He would execute, the word of the Lord perfectly. Other times, he didn't. He didn't execute the word of the Lord properly. And just like another cautionary tale, like Samson, Samson was to be a Nazirite from his mother's womb. And what that entailed was you could not drink the fruit of the vine, okay, alcoholic beverages. You couldn't touch dead carcasses. And you couldn't be no whoremonger. So, but because of Samson's standing among the Lord's people, being a judge, all right, he felt compelled that he didn't have to answer to anybody, all right, outside of the Lord. And even in that, through his disobedience, what he was showcasing to the Lord was, I don't really have to answer to the Most High either, all right, because, as long as I have my hair intact, okay, as long as my hair is present with me, all right, I'm always going to have this strength from the Lord. But, inversely, he made it to be his own strength. All right. And so, I say that to, use that as an analogy for Saul. Saul was given the dominion, he was given the kingship. And, what came with that was not only great responsibility, but that came with great authority. And, when you're given those things and the spirit in that person doesn't want to bend to the authority of the Most High, or eventually that person begins to fall away. All right. But getting back to it, the answer it gave me, it says, Saul's jealousy toward David was not merely a reaction to David's success. It was a reaction to his own loss of identity and security. All right. So it was a loss of identity and security. And so, when a person no longer feels secure in the Lord, all right, it causes a loss of identity. And that, also trickles over to us as a people today, is that our people have lost a sense of identity, which is why they like to call themselves Black or Hispanic or Mexican or even Native American, okay, or African American. They like to identify these things as, basically symbols of identity, you know, but that's only because, the Lord, when you're cut off from the Lord or alienated from the Lord, you have to, it's like, a person that gets wounded, you know, you basically have to, you know, take what's closest to you, and in order to banish that wound, you have to take what's nearest by. So if you have like you don't got proper tools like gauzes and alcohol, or wherever the case is, and not, depending on how severe the wound is, you may have to take a towel. You may have to take a t-shirt, something that is not really used for that, if that makes sense. Basically improper tools. You have to use improper tools in order to stop yourself from bleeding out. And so when that happens and you don't have the proper tools, eventually that person bleeds out and they die. All right. And that is a very uncomfortable, and even in the, you watching the, certain films, like I know that Elder Apostle Tahar goes into the movie Platoon, with the infamous quote, about keeping your ish wired tight, but they would take certain things to bandage the injured soldiers, but in their mind, the soldiers felt, a sense of insecurity. All right. And they would tell them certain things, the one that would be bandaging them up, he would say, "Hey man, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. We going to take you back. And, that favorite nurse of yours is going to tend you up. She's going to treat you up. And man, you going to be all right. You going to be sent back home, and you going to live off the rest of your days, just telling them what they want to hear in their final moments." Okay. And so, this is what he was experiencing through the spirit. And, I'm saying, I didn't feel so lucky if I felt like I was ranting. I was trying to get to the point. I was getting to it, but this is all things he felt through the spirit. All right. Saul was feeling these things through the spirit. And it says in point number one says the loss of kingship. After Samuel prophesied that God the Most High had torn the kingdom from Saul. 1 Samuel 15. Saul lived in a state of existential dread. When David arrived, he represented everything Saul was losing: divine favor, public adoration, and military success. All right. Point number 3. The women's song, the catalyst for Saul's obsession, was the song the women sang after David killed Goliath. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. 1 Samuel 18:7. And, King David was a psalmist. He was a singer himself, So, King David had a lot of gifts from the Lord, and he was able to use those gifts, all right, to magnify the Lord in his name, And so, as we read, when you have those certain gifts from the Lord, and they may be multiple gifts, because he was also a prophet as well. King David was able to, a lot of times through the Psalms, be able to prophesy about future events. Even America, all right, being Babylon the Great. You know, he was able to prophesy and foresee things, in visions, because as Moses, or as the Lord spoke to Moses, I should say, in Numbers the 12th chapter. He told him, you know, I speak to a prophet through a dream, but it's not so with my servant Moses, for I speak to him, mouth to mouth or face to face, you know. And that was a gift in itself, because the Lord was putting a distinction on Moses, all right, on, from other prophets that would come after him, outside of Yahushua, So there's, certain levels of intimacy that the Lord, that he makes with certain men. And, it can be triggering for others. All right. Like a Saul, for example. So it says, this public comparison shattered Saul's ego. Okay. I'm gonna read this again. This public comparison shattered Saul's ego. He perceived David not just as a subordinate, but as the neighbor whom Samuel had warned would take his throne. All right. And so, again, I'm going to read this one more time. He says, he perceived David not just as a subordinate, but as the neighbor whom Samuel had warned would take his throne. All right. And so, that's where the insecurity really came in for Saul, is when he understood that, okay, the neighbor that the Lord said that he would strip the throne away from me, okay, is in this man right here before me, in David. And, all that love, all that adoration, all that, that affection, all that warmness left him, okay, because of this perceived threat in David, all right, for things he hadn't even done yet, because all these things that were going through Saul's mind was, man, he gonna hunt me down, eventually he gonna turn on me. We might be out fighting in a battle, and he turned the sword on me, or he catch me in a solitary place, he playing the harp, he come to me, and it's just me and him alone, and he gonna get me. So I need to get him before he gets me, and so these are all, thoughts that was circulating in Saul's mind. And it says projection of insecurity is the next point. It says Saul was a man who relied heavily on the approval of others. Okay. And this is a form of idolatry. Okay. When a person looks for the approval of others. Okay. Because anything you put on a pedestal has the capabilities of also tearing you down. That's why we're supposed to put the Lord on a pedestal. Okay. Because at least the Lord, when he tears us down, it's not like the world, to where, you're torn down based off of, the whimsicality of another person, because they may be feeling some type of way about you one day and then love you the next. And then the day after that feels another type of way about you, hate you, want to destroy you. Okay. And then go back to loving you a week or a month later. It's not the case with the Lord, because the Lord, unlike people, the Lord does not change. All right. He does not change. And it says, because he had already disobeyed God the Most High and been rejected by the prophet Samuel. He had no internal anchor. David's popularity became a mirror reflecting Saul's failure. All right. And point number 2 says the evil spirit from the Lord. The Bible states that an evil spirit from the Lord tormented Saul. 1 Samuel 16:14. This is often difficult for modern readers to reconcile with a good God, all right, because the Most High is not always, the Most High is good, but the Most High in the things that he does is not always good, all right? And Job is a testament to that, all right, because Job understood, he truly understood this passage here. So let's go to book of Isaiah. Yeah, let's go to Isaiah chapter, this is 45 verse 7, and it reads, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord Yahweh, do all these things. All right. And so, men like Job, perfectly understood that the Lord, was the author of anything evil. Okay. Especially evil spirits. All right. And these are things that, Christianity won't teach. All right. Correctly. I'll say it like that. They won't teach it correctly. All right. Because the Lord is over all things, whether good or bad. Okay. And so when it says again in point 2, the evil spirit from the Lord, the Bible states that the evil spirit from the Lord tormented Saul. And it says, this is often difficult for modern readers to reconcile with a good God. But in the context of ancient Hebrew theology, it serves several purposes. So I thought this was really interesting. It says divine sovereignty. The text emphasizes that even the evil spirit is under God's ultimate authority. It suggests that Saul's mental and spiritual unraveling was a direct consequence of his rejection of God's word. All right. And so, that's one of the biggest fears, that a person can undergo is these spirits. And this is why Yahweh warned Peter that Satan desired to sift you, because anything that is, valuable to the Lord, or because the closest thing to the Lord is the king. All right. The closest thing to the Lord is the king. And, us being of the hopeful elect, we're a nation of kings and priests. So, the evil spirits that, that govern this current earth, constantly want to, sift and, afflict and torment, the people of the Lord, going back to the point in last video, to, put you in a state of spiritual death. All right, to wear you out so bad that you finally give in and you go back into the world, or that you try to, in the case of being lukewarm, infuse the world, into the things of the Lord. Okay. And the Lord is looking for neither of those things. All right. And so it says, point number 2, the withdrawal of the spirits. The evil spirit arrived immediately after the spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. In biblical theology, a person is rarely empty. When the Holy Spirit departs due to persistent rebellion, the individual becomes vulnerable to dark influences, paranoia, and madness. Okay. And, this is a lot of times, and I just use people in Hollywood as an example. This is why you have people that have these episodes. You have, people, even on the average scale, of a citizen, your average 9 to 5 that crashes out, but, I just use people in Hollywood because, Hollywood is definitely a sphere of satanic energy. I say it like that. It's definitely a world entertainment in Hollywood and all those things. It's definitely a world just full of demonic spirits. But a lot of times, like you would see, like with these paparazzis, and they would snap a photo of a celebrity, and they may have a catalog of from the time when they first started off to the time their life ended, and they have snapshots of them, and you see, like I'll just use Michael Jackson as an example. You see from youth Michael Jackson how he started, and how the spirit on him was full of joy, seemingly full of joy and innocency, and had a sincere look, and spoke kind words, was very gentle and everything. But then you see how as he grew older, how his his mind changed, his look changed, and you see certain photos of him, and you would say, and I'm not a person from that era, so I can't really speak indefinitely on Michael Jackson and everything that he you know you know at least from the media, things that he did. But you might see a photo of him, like after his accident or something. You might look at him and be like, man, that's not how a person once remembered Michael Jackson. That's not somebody that is recognizable. All right, to put it and, put it simply, that's not somebody that is recognizable. Okay, because that person has undergone a heavy transformation. All right, based off of essentially the world influencing their mind and their spirit, to do certain things, to go against your own morals and things of that nature. All right. And it's no different with King Saul, because King Saul being a king over the Lord's people, you become a celebrity. All right. In some form of, I'm even going to say some form, in some fashion, you just are. Okay. The person becomes, that of a celebrity. All right. So they're constantly being bombarded with all sorts of temptations. All right. Being at the pinnacle. All right. And so, through his disobedience, it says the individual becomes vulnerable to dark influences, paranoia, and madness. And this is because, and you can even have the wisest men, you can have the wisest men around you, but it's incumbent on that person and the will of the Lord for that individual, whether they not only hearken to that wise counsel, but also, are obedient, because even with, and I use, Solomon's son Rehoboam, for example. you know, Solomon left Rehoboam, wise counsel of men, but Rehoboam, you know, because it was the will of the Lord, Rehoboam ended up hearkening unto the counsel of, young men that had grown up with him, and he forsook the counsel of the wise men that Solomon had left for him, to help him, give administration to the Lord's kingdom. So it's incumbent upon that person to want to, hearken to that counsel that's around him. Okay. And you can, like I said, you can have the best group of men around that individual. But if that person chooses not to listen, then, these are the consequences. Because it says in the next point, it says the consequence of rebellion, the spirit was not an arbitrary punishment. It was the natural outcome of Saul's choices. By choosing his own path over God's, and on, like we say, the will of the Lord was all. This was the ultimate path that the Lord had for Saul. Okay, so when it talks about, because they're trying to, make it seem like he had his own free will to override the will of the Lord. All right, Saul's choices and his path were already slated for him. All right, and it tells us that in the Ephesians. I believe it's the first chapter. Let's go there real quick. Ephesians chapter 1. Yep. Ephesians chapter 1, and I'm going to read verses 4 through 6. It says, according as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world. Okay, this is talking about the elect, or being chosen before the foundation of the world, before anything was made, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Yahushua Hamashiach to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, wherein he hath made us accepted in the beloved. All right. So the Lord has, he predestines, just like how he's predestined his elect, his saints, and, all Israel are the saints, but, particularly like men like a King David. Okay. The Lord's, allotted King David, to be counted among the congregation of the saints, because that's just that was King David's lot. Saul, on the other hand, his lot was, to be an example of essentially what not to be, and that's just, the story of Saul is a very, it's a scary story, meant to put the fear of the Lord in, the individual, the reader, because, like I said, Saul had a very good beginning. He walked with the Lord, and, it was a great king, but over, course of time, Saul, allowed the world to change his way of, ways of thinking, and his ultimately changed his mind toward the Lord, because Saul always thought, he had it, he was going to have it. He felt entitled to, this free gift from the Lord, all right, to be, made the shepherd of the Lord's people, you know. And, it's a very, I would say, scary story. You talk about horror films and, scary movies. Hey, man, the end that Saul had is really is a horror. Okay. It's a real horror how Saul went out. But getting back to this point here, it says, by choosing his own path over God's, and we clarified that the path that he chose was ultimately slated by the Most High. It says Saul created a vacuum in his soul that was filled by bitterness and fear. Number 3, the tandem. Why the intensity? The intensity of Saul's jealousy was fueled by the evil spirit, acting as an accelerant on his existing character flaws, paranoia, and a spiritual state. The evil spirit intensified Saul's natural insecurities into full-blown paranoia. He became incapable of viewing David's actions rationally. Even David's loyalty, playing the harp to soothe Saul, fighting his battles, was interpreted by Saul as a manipulative plot to usurp the throne. All right. And so, these are the things that can ultimately stem from the spirit of jealousy. All right. If a person does not put a cap on, that spirit, because, what comes from jealousy is envies. What comes from envies is murders. Okay. It speaks about that. It says the jealousy of a man, hold on, because I don't want to, I think I'm butchering. The rage of a jealousy, or the rage of a man is jealousy, or the jealousy of a man is rage. I'm either saying it backwards and I'm butchering it terribly, but let me see. I want to say it's the rage of a man. Okay, yeah. It says, for jealousy is the rage of a man. Therefore, he will not spare in the day of vengeance. Okay, there's one that slippeth with his tongue, but yet not in his heart. It says, it's found in Proverbs 6:34 in the Bible. Okay, and this is going into adultery, but no, it can also be applied to in the sense of envying another person. Okay, because just like with adultery, what comes of that is the suspicion that your wife may be doing certain things with another man. And so and even then, back then in the law, in order to sort that out, you would give the woman bitter waters to drink, and that would sort things out. Because if you left the man up to his own mind to say, well, I think this is going on, and I feel like this is going on, and those thoughts and those those ideas fester in a person's mind long enough, eventually he's going to take matters into his own hand. All right, even without sound proof. Okay, and so that's a very dangerous place to be. Is to be suspicious of one, and it all just comes from this one spirit. Because the Most High, he's the difference between Yahweh Bashem Yahushai's jealousy and the jealousy of man is that the Most High's jealousy is divine, and it's protective. It's a protective love. Man's jealousy, on the other hand, like a Saul, it's not protective love. It's not protective jealousy. You're not trying to put up any safeguards, or anything because of your jealousy. Like the Lord may get upset if a person commits idolatry and worships another god, but he'll put up safeguards, and correct that person so that, it be not done, which is love. Obviously, unless the person persists in that thing, then, that's where, he begins to really take things into account. But, in the sense of man, man's jealousy is very, very faulty, and very warped in how it views its suspect. Very, very deceitful. That spirit of jealousy is highly deceitful, when operating under the flesh. So, on that note, I want to go into that topic of, of jealousy, and, just use King Saul as a backdrop because, he's a very, very good example of how that spirit can literally rot out the bones of a person. And like we know with King Saul was able to do many great things, great acts, even, under that spirit. But it ended up warping his understanding, his perception. All right. It ended up him destroying a relationship and relationships, I should say, with not just great men like King David, but it ended up destroying his rapport with the congregation of Israel. Because even to the point where he took out that wrath on certain of the priests. So yeah, man, just wanted to drop this through the Spirit. Pray that it was edifying through the Spirit. And I like to give all glory, honor, and praises to Yahweh Ba'Shem, Yahweh Shai Ba'Shem, Bracha Kwadash. Double honors once again to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. And salutations to the hopeful elect, the lambs and the sheep of Yahweh Ba'Shem, Yahweh Shai. And with that I say, till next time, Shalom.